So we're really excited this morning. We've got a great lineup and we're starting off really strong. I'm so happy that we have Dr. Jesse Goldberg here. He's a visiting research fellow at Auburn University, and he received his PhD in African American literature at Cornell University in 2018. So he's currently working on his book project titled Abolition Time, Reading Queer Justice in Slavery's Afterlife. And he's taught at a variety of institutions, from private research universities to public liberal arts colleges and inside state prisons, state and federal prisons, I believe. And so I think that that's going to give us some really great insights into looking at remaking pedagogy and remaking university generally, and how we teach in non-traditional settings. And then we have Sri Chatterjee as well. She, her, I'm sorry, Jesse Goldberg's pronouns are he, him. Sri Chatterjee, she, her, is a PhD student and a labor organizer at University of Pittsburgh. And she works on post-colonial studies, kind of at the intersection of post-colonial studies, environmental humanities, and Black studies. And she's an international student from India as well, and has written about that experience. So I think that she'll have a lot of interesting insights in terms of telling us how we can better accommodate students and faculty and staff who are not from this country. And I'm really excited. I'm just going to hand it over now to Jesse and Sri.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Melissa, and good morning, folks. Sri, do you want to kind of start, or I can kind of start, or we can start with maybe reading the prompts that we were given, if you want to do that?
Yeah, sure. Maybe you can start with the prompt and then we can all like chime in.
Sure, yeah. So leading up to today, Alyssa sent us these really provocative prompts to think about. So the first was, although we see overlapping jobs, funding, and access crises across higher education under COVID-19, these reflect entrenched systems of exploitation and oppression. Can you describe some of the major inequities that have defined higher education and helped shape the world beyond, which were amplified by the pandemic? So that was the first kind of prompt that we were given.
Yeah, so I think that before even going to some of the important questions that this prompt itself raises, I think I'll begin this by mentioning a chain of events that I was witness to, being an international student in India as well in the US. So in December 2019 and January 2020, the state-sponsored police gets into the campus of two premier institutions in India. Jamia Millia Islamia, which is a minority university, and Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, which is known for its radical left politics. The police beats up students and also fire bullets at students who are studying in the library. So this is sometime in December and January 2020. And trigger alert, suicide. In June 2020, a girl in the state of Kerala in India commits suicide because she was not able to continue her education because of not having adequate access to technology, and schools had shifted completely online. In July 2020, which is just the next month, the ICE in the US comes out with a xenophobic regulation right in the middle of a pandemic, that international students must leave the country if their institutions went fully online. Personally, being an international student myself, I had a mini breakdown. And I was also extremely worried for some of my colleagues who were especially affected by Trump's Muslim ban and had no home, had no country to go back to. The international office of my university sent out emails which kind of adhered to the ICE regulations, and there was no proper guidance about what to do if indeed we had to leave the country. So I felt that this ICE regulation in July 2020 once again exposed that the foundations of universities continue to be driven by white supremacy. There was outrage, there were protests, there were legal suits, but and subsequently the ruling was temporarily stalled. But I think the hurt that it has left on the bodies of, Black students, queer folks, and person of color is sort of very difficult to fathom. An incident might get over, but the hurt doesn't go, and the hurt that comes with each of these incidents. So I think that what is important in each of these events is the rise of right wing across nations, especially in case of India, and which is a direct attack on the face of public education itself. Like, I know that I couldn't have been here had it not been for the free public education in India. But with every month, it seems that the government comes down heavily on public universities and tries to defund a section of it. So I think that in order to understand that what are some of the symptoms that COVID has made even more acute, we need to strike, or we need to think right at the very base of it, which is white supremacy and the rise of the right wing. Yeah, so that's just like a few introductory comments in response to that question.
I really appreciate the way you've kind of so lucidly and concisely tied together what sometimes get listed in that kind of way that issues get listed, of like all the isms that contribute to inequalities, but the way that like you've struck there, and I like your use of the verb strike, Sri, at that root of white supremacy that is kind of at the base of higher education. I was thinking about, from my side of things, I'm thinking in more kind of within the US, how that is linked to really right wing, but also this kind of bipartisan and left and right co-curricular, this kind of bipartisan divestment in higher education here in the US. I'm thinking about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's notion of organized abandonment. I'm thinking of Beth Ritchie's notion of building what she calls a prison nation. And I'm thinking about like how, for me, watching a lot of university responses, a lot of faculty responses, a lot of these inequalities amongst student, in terms of student access, play out, the way that we're seeing the real carceral logic of how universities are run and how universities, both at the level of kind of culture. I want to talk a little bit about what this word I've been throwing around, copidemics, how university culture is about that, but also materially how we find ourselves in a situation where this foundation of white supremacy that you've pointed to, Sri, is part and parcel with the way that the bipartisan investment in carcerality, in the growth of the prison industrial complex, in the growth of the military industrial complex is the other side of the coin of the divestment from higher education. I also want to plug really quick an article I literally read yesterday on the New Republic by Astra Taylor, The End of the University, which does a really lovely job of tracing in the US a kind of historical ways in which these responses in the late 20th century to more people of color, more Black people, more brown people, more left-wing kind of vibrant politics happening on US public US campuses winds up being met with bipartisan divestment. It does a very nice job of talking about these things. So I just want to plug that and say, yes, like what we're dealing with and what we need to name from the very beginning of the day is white supremacy and how that affects all of the isms that we can list as the inequalities that happen, right? And so just to say a couple things about what I mean by carceral logic, and what I see happening in the era of COVID, oh my God. Sorry, I'm catching my own academic speak happening as it's happening, and I'm annoying myself. But what I've been really struck by is a really, really strict adherence to policy over flexibility. I can't I can't like get over the amount of conversations I have with folks who are like, where we just look at each other, or not look at each other, we're on the phone, or we're not actually in person, right? But you look at each other and you're like, why are we trying to continue to do things like we've always done them? I remember at my last university I was working at Longwood in Virginia, we were having discussions about what to do with student grades, and I was one of these folks who was like, give everybody A's, right? Like they're dealing with a pandemic, and the retreat to, no, we must have rigor, we must have policy, we can't do X, Y, or Z because we have rules that say we must, and the inability to think beyond rule and policy, and the adherence to these kinds of standards that were constructed. If we made the standards, we can change the standards. But the way that there's this kind of this culture of order that says we must follow policy and follow rule, and I'm thinking very much here of Fred Moten's distinction between policy and planning as I'm saying this, right? Which I don't want to do at 8:30 in the morning, but like that's what I'm thinking of academically, right? I'm also, that's kind of like a cultural thing. A second is any folks who are on academic Twitter, I'm sure you see every day there's a new viral tweet of some faculty member who's basically, like the latest one I saw was tracking students' eye movements on Zoom and during quizzes. Are you cheating? Like the way that there's this kind of enculturation into behavior management, which we then see on this larger level of blaming increasing COVID cases on student behavior rather than looking at the structures of how have universities planned or not planned for proper reopening. And I think what this makes me want to highlight this morning, as I think about, for me, the thing that I can't wake up every day and not think about is university reopening plans. And how they have exacerbated all of these inequalities, again, all the isms that are built up upon white supremacy, and the way that we're seeing this policing of student behavior. We have students reporting each other, trying to get each other expelled. We have university presidents sending letters telling students, if you want, it's on you to save the academic year, and it's heartbreaking to me because while a lot of it is nefarious, it isn't all simply nefarious, because the situation that we're in, where universities are reopening, is the result of decades of that divestment. And so we've seen since the 1970s, right, this shift from when colleges were close to or even free, public colleges, I'm thinking about New York and California especially, and we've seen this kind of reaction to left-wing political activity, which has made college less affordable, this divestment of state funding, where there are public colleges now that the majority of their funding, I'm thinking of Penn State, the majority of Penn State's funding does not come from the state, right? And that happens for decades, and then you find yourself with a pandemic, and by the way, because the state isn't funding you, if you don't collect your tuition dollars, your college might have to close. Right, and so that's the reality for some, especially smaller universities across the nation, right? And so we have this moment where there are these where what we're seeing is these carceral logics of policing student behavior, policing individuals, where we see what privatization really means, right? The privatization of behavior itself, responsibility itself. I'm thinking of Saidiya Hartman and the burden of responsibility. When we see that is coming after 5 decades of divestment, whereas that divestment was happening, there was investment in the buildup of the prison industrial complex. That what we wind up seeing is that over 5 decades of building a larger prison industrial complex and decreasing funding to higher education institutions wind up functioning more like carceral institutions. And that, to me, is a scary thing that COVID has highlighted, right? That we now have a higher education system that operates on carceral logics, because carceral logics are the very things that have, over decades, built up and further entrenched the white supremacy that was already at the root of higher education, right? So these are the kinds of things that I've been thinking about in my kind of very US-centric context.
Yeah, I think, because you mentioned carceral logic, I think I did come across this in academic Twitter itself, that if, some professor in some university, if a student has happened to submit the first 5 assignments by time, then the student gets a come out of the jail and doesn't have to submit the 6th assignment. So even when it is meant to, like, to be generous and kind, the language itself is couched in that vocabulary of cursory logic, which I think is so scary and frightening, as you rightly put it, right? I think that I will maybe go on to ask you the second prompt that we had. Is that okay? Okay. Right. Yes, so the second prompt that we had, and I think that this is crucial in understanding how we remake or build the university in our own image. We see colleges and universities on the brink of total collapse under the weight of the systems of exploitation. Thinking broadly about humanities instruction, what futures do you envision as necessary for a higher education system defined by access, equity, and justice?
So I loved this question, and I wrote a list of 7 things. And I'm not going to read this whole list because I'm looking at the clock too, but just to like quickly hit on some of the things that made me think of. And I think it's interesting that I didn't immediately think of pedagogy. I thought of kind of what happens before we get into the classroom for my entire list of things that I thought of. The first thing on my list was labor solidarity among academic workers. I think we have no university future without labor solidarity and labor activism. And I can't say that strongly enough. I have details that we can talk about throughout the day, which we will, because this is going to be a wonderful day around tables. I also have here, public universities need to be funded enough by their state budgets to be free. Public education, public higher ed has to be free. And that is an imperative to me, and that requires political mobilization. I will also say that free college isn't necessarily free of white supremacy, so that's a bare minimum, right? That's not the goal, that's a bare minimum, right? So robust affirmative action programs as part of material reparations is necessary. The abolition of all campus police and divestment from relationships between higher ed and the prison industrial complex. Get cops off campuses, I can't say it enough, right? Divest from fossil fuels in the military industrial complex. I had a campus visit at some university once that I'm not going to name, but when I asked how they had so much money and my perception of their budget was so off, they mentioned that they help build a lot of weapons for the US military and they get a lot of funding that way. And I was very frightened by that, the casualness that was just thrown out as a thing. So yeah, divestment from those kinds of sources and investment in green energy and things like that. Reversing adjunctification, part of labor, right? I want to fly through my list here. I also so my last 2 things, first one's very quick. Universities to actually adopt justice-oriented mission statements. I'm so sick of diversity language that doesn't name specifics. Just fucking say that Black Lives Matter, right? Just fucking say it and mean it. Actually make it unacceptable for faculty to be transphobic, right? If a faculty member is going to misgender students, that shit can't fly, like, period. And the last thing I had, as I fly through my notes, is more listening and more democratic participation in running universities. Boards of trustees just raise my blood pressure, and my blood pressure is up at 10 to 9 in the morning on a Saturday because I'm thinking about board of trustees decisions. But I'm thinking about like the model being set by colleagues at Michigan right now. I'm thinking about labor organizing. I'm thinking about the Debt Collective. I'm thinking about these collectives of people that are democratically coming together to figure out how to build futures. And I'm thinking that the future of the university depends upon that kind of democratic participation. So I'll leave it at that and kind of throw it back to you, Sri, if I can, and see what kinds of things you thought about there.
Yeah, I think that collective organizing and the focus on labor was at the heart of how I approached thinking about radical social equity and justice. If I might add here, when the ICE ruling came out, there was a dominant discourse that, well, the international students, we need to treat our international students well because they bring monies to the university. And I was like, wait, what are you talking about? And that's the reason why a university can be made sanctuary campus. I'm like, but well, a campus needs to be a sanctuary university because there are also undocumented students. And I wish I could have that reaction on faculty's face when they hear that they have students who are undocumented, and they're like, oh, is that a thing? And so organizing to make sure that our universities gradually move into the idea of sanctuary campuses and having no links with the police whatsoever. The second thing I think, which I personally find crucial, is that the pursuit of truth and collective organizing goes together, goes hand in hand. So what I had in mind was also the relationships that universities have with communities, both within and outside the university spaces. Like in many cases, I know in Pittsburgh there are neighborhoods who do not feel comfortable in coming to the University of Pittsburgh because they say that it's not my space, right? And if the university says that, well, we tried but we could not reach out, then the university has to own up to it and do like really better. So it's really locating the university within the ecosystem of communities, both within and both around. Because if there is no community involvement, if there is no community engagement, then the university remains in that space of ivory tower, and then that continues to perpetuate a very dangerous culture of anti-intellectualism, which I think is also quite harmful for the university, right? So these are the three primary things that I have: collective organizing, building relationships within and communities, and sanctuary campuses, and then gradually maybe sanctuary cities all around the US.